Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Michael. Just a brief introduction for those of you that don't know RUSI. RUSI was founded in 1831 by the Duke of Wellington. So we are the oldest defense and security institute in the world that is still in operation, so I've been told. Apparently there are older institutes, although I've not heard of them. And the goal of the institute as it was set up by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was to foster debate and open discussion about the great affairs of the day, particularly with regard to military affairs, Britain's imperial aspirations overseas, and particularly to give a voice to those people serving overseas who could come back to the United Kingdom and offer on-the-record comment and debate about some of the key issues of the day that were challenging them. Those debates were written down and they were put into a journal. And that became the RUSI Journal, which is the oldest defense and security publication currently in existence. And we aim to keep some of that spirit, some of that zeitgeist of the Institute in our work today. So we try to be a forum for open debate and ideas and for discussion about the sorts of things that affect not just the United Kingdom, but the world. We are a global institution, and we operate in pretty much every continent bar Antarctica and South America. So we try to be involved in all the great affairs of the day. My job as a Middle East analyst, obviously, is to look primarily at the Gulf, but also I've spent a lot of time working in Iraq and working with the Iraqi Kurds. And I've spent a bit of time in Syria with the Syrian Kurds. And it's on that issue that I want to talk to you today. And we've had quite a number of developments, of course, in the Kurdish political scene, and I want to go through those and try and break them down for you, but more importantly, explain what these might mean moving forward. So the first thing is, it's quite a complicated topic, the Kurds. There's a lot of them. Gosh, aren't there? Well, I will break this down and make it slightly easier for you, but that's my daily business, to make sort of sense of these structures which exist here. And believe you me, there are more of them now than existed then a year ago when that diagram was made. No point in writing them all down. It will just become a futile exercise. But what I want to do is try and make it a little bit easier so you can geographically locate where some of these factions are operating. So, more or less, we have the Kurds split over 4 countries. There are some in Armenia, but they don't tend to play a role in that country's polity. And we have, of course, in Turkey, the largest population of Kurds at around 25 million. The main political representative for them are the HDP, the People's Democratic Party, left-wing and socialist. And, of course, there is an armed insurgency which has taken root since the late 70s, but of course declared war against the Turkish state in 1984, and that is known as the Kurdistan Workers' Party. They are called the PKK. And their imprisoned leader, Abdullah Öcalan, is a sort of semi-deified figure for PKK acolytes. And they fight an insurgency based around here in what is known as the Kandil Mountains, and they have a large presence in those areas. And they and the Turks are in almost daily confrontation with one another. They have affiliate parties in Iran known as PJAK, which is the Party for Free Life of Kurdistan, and also the PYD, the Democratic Union Party in Syria, which is the political wing of what we know as the YPG. Iraq, it's a little bit more complicated, and I know that we have a couple of gentlemen in this room who have a significant experience of diplomatic activity in Iraq. The Kurdistan Democratic Party, led by President Masoud Barzani, who is president but not president these days, and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, who was, until 2 months ago, led by Jalal Talabani, who has now passed away from complications relating to old age. These two parties actually have their roots way back in the early 60s and have roots across the Western world, in the United States, in the United Kingdom. They have operations in Europe and have more or less been accepted by pretty much every Western country as being legitimate. They had been seen in the 80s as terrorist organizations, and even up into the 2000s were still listed as such but are now fully considered democratic and representative legal parties in the Iraqi political framework. And the upcomer Goran, the change movement, which split off from the PUK, which presents itself as a sort of radical, young, free movement and against the establishment party, but has since become very establishment and suffering from some of the problems of its cousins in the PUK. So that is the broad political framework that we look at today. And of course, the most complicated subject is the Iraqi Kurds, because they have achieved already a legal, recognized autonomy that other areas of Kurdistan have not. So this is where you find the main concentration of Kurds, around 9 million in Iran, about 5.5 million in Iraq, spread over mixed ethnic areas. Part of that is through deliberate design from Saddam Hussein and his Arabization policies in the 1970s and 80s, and in particular culminating in what was known as the Anfal campaign, which was a targeted policy of part extermination and part forced mass migration against Kurdish areas, particularly in the city of Kirkuk. But you find Kurds stretching all the way down to the southeast here and down into Mandali, which is about 50 kilometers east of Baghdad. And these are the historical Kurdish heartlands. Now, in Syria, it's a little different. Syrian Kurds are actually not a big population, but they have a lot of territory. There's only 2.5 million Syrian Kurds, but by God, do they control a lot of area, although this is technically under the control of Turkey. And then you have, of course, the vast majority of Kurmanji-speaking Kurds in Turkey, around 25 million of them, who represent the vast majority of the Kurdish population today, with another 3 million living in Istanbul. Istanbul is technically the most populous Kurdish city on the planet, even though we might not associate it with being in the Kurdish heartlands. So that's what it looks like, and I want to focus particularly, and I'm very happy to take questions on Iran and Turkey, should you so wish, on the two issues that actually we struggle with as policymakers, which are Iraqi Kurdistan and Syrian Kurdistan. I want to start with Iraq, but first of all, this was a picture, and I don't know if the resolution is very good here, but I thought it summed up the situation in 2016 really well. The aspirations that the Kurds held at that time, and where they thought the process of Kurdish independence was headed. In 2016, it was almost thought southern Kurdistan, that is the Kurdistan region of Iraq, known as Bashur, was free. Western Kurdistan, Rojava, where the sun touches the water, was in the process of becoming free. Turkish Kurdistan, where the HDP had made significant gains in areas that President Erdogan and his AKP were previously strong, was beginning to show the potential for some sort of autonomy. And unfortunately, poor old Iranian Kurdistan, Rojhelat, where the sun rises in the east, was yet to be discussed and still is not really discussed these days. In 2 years, that picture of hope, I'm afraid to say, is extremely different. And what we have seen is essentially the winding back of Kurdish political aspirations, not through their own choices, but through the choices largely of others. So let's focus on Iraq, and forgive the Arabic here. I think Hooky could probably read it, but for those of you that don't know, this is actually the Iraqi election results in 2014. Nouri al-Maliki and his State of Law coalition managed to win the largest block of seats, and together with Muqtada al-Sadr and Ammar al-Hakim formed the Shia bloc, which was always and always will be a demographic majority in the Iraqi parliament. But the Kurds have a large chunk as well, and were able to secure a number of seats, which made them a significant political player in 2014, just before the invasion of the Islamic State. So this election was held in May, and ISIS came careering through Mosul in June, just a few weeks later. And of course, this radically changed the coalition and the State of Law party, or the Dawa party. Maliki was ousted and replaced by Haider al-Abadi, a completely different type of politician, seen as more egalitarian, more willing to reach across the divide to Sunnis here, and more able to work with the Kurds. At that point, it seemed almost like a break between Baghdad and Erbil, Mr. Barzani and Erbil, was inevitable under Maliki. And Maliki was being presented by the Kurds at that time as a Shia version of Saddam Hussein. Well, what had happened, of course, following the infiltration of ISIS was a front line established by the Peshmerga, which ran more or less close to Mosul, took over the contested area of Sinjar, where the Yazidi population lived, most of the Yazidis who were unfortunately subject to ethnic cleansing by Islamic State and massacres by Islamic State, were eventually, after a lot of contestation between PKK and KDP Kurds, essentially found a Peshmerga force sitting around here. And you had in all of this area, down to Mandali in the southeast, a Kurdish line of control, essentially a Maginot line of Peshmerga, digging in, ready to defend what they saw as their historic lands of Kurdistan. But unfortunately, most of these lands were not recognized by the Iraqi state as belonging to Kurdistan and not recognized by the international community. It's important to note at this point that there are a number of clauses in the Iraqi constitution that mandate these particular territories being subject to political agreement. And one of the problems under the constitutional article of 140, it's called the 140 article, there were different interpretations, shall we say. The Kurds believed that Baghdad never initiated the negotiations in good faith. Baghdad, of course, only started to talk about these contested areas when it appeared that the Kurds were making a final push for control, using their Peshmerga as a means to do that. The Kurdistan regional government, as we had previously understood it, was more or less, before the time of the referendum, split between the two major parties, the PUK and the KDP. And these were essentially the main figures that you needed to pay attention to. So you had, of course, the Barzanis, led by President Masoud Barzani, Prime Minister Nechirvan Barzani, and Chancellor of the National Security Council, Masroor Barzani, who was the son of the president. And then on the other side, although the PUK is a very, very diverse party, and I won't go into inter-PUK factions, the Talabani boys, the sons of Jalal Talabani, more or less controlling the major security wings of the party and possessing deep contacts, not only into Baghdad, but also with Iran, and particularly with Lahore Talabani, the intelligence services, known as the Zanyari, who, if you control the intelligence services in Kurdistan, you possess a lot of information on all your rivals. And if you possess information on your rivals, then you have something over them. And if you have something over them, that makes you powerful. So these two chaps, who both grew up in South London and speak with quite strong South London accents, I might add, have an incredible amount of power. They are cousins. Bafal is the son of Jalal Talabani. His brother is the deputy prime minister. So this is a bit of a simplistic way of putting it, but we don't have long to explain all the internal factions. But essentially, Barzani, Talabani. And that was the major power players as it stood all the way up to September of last year before the referendum. Now, I think it's worth going back in time because it's important to understand what happened between KDP and PUK. There is a rivalry, and they did fight a civil war in the mid-90s, which culminated in a ceasefire agreement in 1998, in which these rough areas of Iraqi Kurdistan were split into two. To this day, many people still don't know why the civil war was fought. And when you ask people that were involved in that time, they still can't answer it either. One of the main reasons was greed, control over access to border crossings, hotels, and sources of revenue. And the political parties in Kurdistan are powerful because they are patronage networks tied to families and to entrenched business interests. And this is one of the problems that Kurdistan is facing, is that it is economically insolvent. It is running at a massive deficit, and the political parties are more or less self-interested. And I'm afraid to say the history of their activity was that they were willing to fight a civil war with each other, not really for political gain, but for personal financial gain. But nevertheless, these divisions existed right up to the referendum in September 25 and are one of the main reasons that the referendum campaign came apart so spectacularly as it did. So let's move forward to the referendum. Mr. Barzani decides that on September the 25th, that the Kurds will go and vote and make a statement about whether they wanted independence or not. So what did they choose? Well, 92% of them voted to become independent. I don't think that was a huge surprise to anyone at all. But if you look into the numbers, it's a bit more complicated than that, because in areas that are controlled by the KDP, you had large voter irregularities. In the province of Dahak, initial figures showed that the turnout was 134%. Very good turnout, goodness me. In the areas down here controlled by PUK, the turnout was much lower, it's about 40 to 45%. So there was clearly political differences, and many Kurds felt that the drive for a referendum was more about glorifying Masoud Barzani and his legacy than it was about the best interests of the Kurds, moving the Kurds towards further self-rule and autonomy. And one of the biggest problems, and I think from a Western perspective, was not so much that there was a referendum in and of itself. It's that there was a referendum being held in these areas here, in these disputed areas that we discussed 5 minutes ago, in which there are large populations of Christians, Yazidis, Turkmens, and minorities like Shabaks as well, who simply did not want to accept the imposition of Kurdish rule upon them. And to this extent, the Kurdistan regional government and the authorities in Kurdistan were just simply not very good at convincing the international community that they had solved this question and that they were operating legally within the constitution to hold a referendum in areas that had not been agreed as being under the legal control of the Kurdistan regional government. Yes, their Peshmerga forces were present in Kirkuk. They were present around the eastern edge of Mosul. They were present in Sinjar. But they had not been legally recognized as such. And this was where it began to look less like a referendum and more like an annexation attempt, a way of unilaterally imposing conditions on the Iraqi people and particularly ethnic minorities in the area. Here's the next problem. Nobody outside of Kurdistan wanted this to happen, and they pushed back extremely hard. And it all went spectacularly wrong just a couple of months later. So this is the citadel in Kirkuk, and this is the flag of the Iraqi Turkmen party. Only 2 weeks before that, the Iraqi Kurds had raised their flag on the citadel in Kirkuk. And of course, this was a clear statement by the Turkish or the Turkic minority in Kirkuk that absolutely under no circumstances were the Kurds to unilaterally push for control in Kirkuk. These young men are sitting in the governor's office in Kirkuk. I've sat there myself in different times when it was controlled by PUK Governor Najmuddin Karim. These are men loyal to the Shia militias controlled by Iran. And just after that picture was taken, they put up a picture of the Iranian supreme leader, just to make the point clear who their sponsor was and who was now in charge. Nevertheless, one of the things that became very interesting to note was that Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, by taking these measures and pushing Kurdish forces out of Kirkuk and some of these disputed areas, became extremely popular as a result. And he began to push the initiative. He began to push all the way up into Sinjar, almost to the border crossings here with Syria. Began to push all the way up here. And you see all these oil fields? He made damn sure he had control of most of those. So Baghdad swooped on the economic lifeline of the Kurdish region, strangling it almost from becoming an economically viable area. So they took the strategic areas of Sinjar, Mahmoud, Kirkuk, Khanaqin, and of course secured the oil fields of Bay Hassan around here and Havana Dome, which more or less cut Kurdistan's oil production by 55%. So from a situation in which they were producing and exporting over 500,000 barrels of oil a day, they were left with 230,000 barrels of oil a day, which is nowhere near the revenue stream that is needed to fund their government. As much as 70% of Iraqi Kurdistan's population are employed in the public sector. How do they get paid? They get paid by oil sales. So if Mr. Abadi and the Popular Mobilization Forces, or the Shia militias, overtake those areas, then it stands to reason that Kurdistan cannot pay its government salaries. To this day, not one salary has been paid since September for any of these public servants in the Kurdistan region. The dream is over. The Kurds have gone down to Baghdad. Numerous different parties have made their way down to discuss how to pay their bills, how the money will be allocated, how the sharing of resources of these oil fields and the income streams will be allocated so that the Kurdistan regional government is able to pay its salaries. And there are differences, of course, between the parties. The PUK looked to strike a deal early with Baghdad, leaving the KDP to its own devices to be stuck up in a landlocked area in the northwest of Iraqi Kurdistan, essentially neutered as a political power, whilst the PUK maintained its linkages and its patronage networks in Baghdad. And they're very good at that, by the way. I was in Baghdad in December, and you see PUK influence in some of the key crossings into the Green Zone, and you do not see KDP influence in there. And so what has happened now, of course, is that Mr. Abadi has made sure that the shoe is on his foot, and he has ensured that the likelihood of an independent Kurdistan emerging any time in the next 2 to 3 decades is all but impossible. It would take more or less a complete implosion of the Iraqi state, possibly facing something far more virulent and dangerous than the Islamic State, which almost threatened to bring Iraq to its knees, for this equation to be broken. And I would hazard a guess that Western policy priorities are, at the moment, all about propping up Mr. Abadi to prevent Iran from further infiltration into Iraq, because, as we know, the Americans don't like Iran very much, and Hyder Abadi is seen as the main source of stability against the Iranians. Funnily enough, he's now gone into coalition on a list of elections, which are coming up in May, with some of the key Shia militias controlled by Iran. So we got that calculation wrong. Happy days. So what I'm afraid to say is that that picture of Iraqi Kurdistan being free needs to be scrubbed from our minds. And the Kurds, more or less, will do what Baghdad tells them. Previously, it had been the case that 17% of the budget of Iraq's federal government was to be allocated to the Kurds. Mr. Abadi decided to offer between 11 and 12%. There are negotiations ongoing at the moment, but I doubt very much that he will go above that figure. Here's the other issue. The Kurds have still not paid the oil companies operating in these contested zones and owe tens of billions of dollars and have no way to pay it back. The federal government of Iraq has said that it won't honor those debts, and so the Kurdistan regional government is more or less in indentured servitude as long as Baghdad doesn't pay the bills of these private companies operating in the area. BP have smartly seen an opening and have moved into this field here and have secured for themselves 250,000 barrels of oil a day and are doing very well, thank you very much. And they've signed a deal with Baghdad and not with the Kurds. So I'm afraid to say oil politics is quite important in understanding where the Iraqi Kurds sit at the moment, quite apart from the fact that Iran, Turkey, the Gulf states, and pretty much every Western country apart from Israel opposed the referendum and did nothing to stop the retake of these lands by the central government. And that's what I want to focus on right now in terms of policy. Western countries were more than happy to back the Kurds to the hilt when they fought ISIS, but when it came to political calculations, they didn't lift a finger, either to push forward the referendum or aspirations for independence, or when Baghdad exacted its revenge to stop Baghdad, other than to tell them not to go into Kurdish majority areas or legally recognized Kurdistan region of Iraq. So we have played a rather passive role in all of this. And to some extent, those of you that have been involved in the policy world, that doing nothing is a policy. Absolutely. Sitting and watching is a policy. Letting the Kurds get their comeuppance is a policy. But I think here we have to talk very seriously about Mr. Barzani and his misreading of the international community. Mr. Barzani, I think, assumed that the goodwill that he had built by fighting the Islamic State would bring people on side at the moment in which he forced the issue with this referendum. And my goodness, did he misread it. Now, there is a particular accusation here about the Kurds being sold out. I put my hand up and I'd like to defend the United Kingdom and the United States here. I don't think the Kurds were sold out. There were many, many protestations from the United Kingdom and the United States not to go ahead with the referendum. It was very different from the Iranians, who actively threatened the Kurds and said, if you go ahead with the referendum, very bad things will happen. And of course, very bad things did happen. But from our perspective, the line which has come out from Erbil is that you sold us out. Well, we never sold them anything in the first place. And so there was never a promise that was broken. And I think it's important to understand that, because there is a bit of shrill rhetoric coming out from the Kurds at the present time. And I think it was made clear on several occasions that it would not be supported. And of course, it was not supported. So to that extent, although Western policy can sometimes look very inconsistent in the region, on this particular issue, it was pretty consistent. So what are the consequences for the KRI, the Kurdistan region of Iraq? Well, there are new parties emerging as a result of this. Kurds on the street are angry. They feel let down. Some of them because they felt that their Peshmerga should have defended them from the infiltration of the Iraqi government into historical Kurdish lands. But more that the KDP and the PUK once again couldn't come together to provide a united front to defend Kurdistan once again, as 5-6 months have passed without salaries. The KDP and the PUK officials still enjoy lavish lifestyles, rather affluent living standards, and the average guy on the street gets nothing at all. And anger has risen. People are frustrated. Protests broke out over the Christmas period. Of course, many of you probably didn't see that because you were in your Christmas holidays, but it was a very serious moment in Kurdistan. And guess what? Our Kurdish friends shot at protesters and killed some of them. Party offices were burned down. Anger is rising, and new parties have emerged. Parties on the left of the political spectrum, but also more established figures like that of Barham Saleh, who was a previously very powerful official in the PUK, who is now running on his own independent political list, trying to push for change, trying to break the stranglehold that the KDP and the PUK have, not only on security, not only on politics, but most of all on the economy. And it is this issue, I think, that is very, very serious for Kurdistan. And of course, Baghdad is in control of the economic levers of the KRI for decades. But here's the one thing: if the Kurds play it smart, then they could change Baghdad for the better if they play smart coalition politics. For the last 4 or 5 years, the Kurdistan region has tended to back away from dealing with politics in Baghdad, preferring to move with its own political project and advancing the cause of separation from the Iraqi state. But now, if they see an opportunity in Iraqi politics, divided as it is, they could play the unruly coalitions which form in Baghdad to their benefit and become swing actors in many of the votes which take place down there. So there is some light at the end of the tunnel. It's not all bad news, but it is news which exists within the Iraqi polity and in no other way. And I think that's the key point to take away. Now, I just want to move on to Syria here. And our other friends, the Syrian Kurds, are caught in a major crossfire. And particularly between these two men, and particularly with this organization. The Putin-Trump bromance is strong in Syria, as the Syrian Kurds are finding out to their detriment. And what is this alliance based upon? Well, it's mostly what we call a CT-led strategy, counter-terrorism first. And I know that US officials have now come out and said that counterterrorism is not the main lens through which they look at the region, that it's all about China and it's all about Russia. Well, in the Middle East, it's all about counterterrorism. I think it's fascinating as a student of the region, as somebody that was at university in 2003, when all we talked about was democracy promotion and going into Iraq and democratizing it, etc. Nobody talks about that these days. I don't hear one serious official talking about democratization in the region or about even things like good governance. The vast majority of the assets deployed in Syria and Iraq are counterterrorism assets or stabilization assets, humanitarian relief and assistance. But nobody's talking about good governance. So what was Syria for the United States? Well, it was never in the US sphere of influence. Historically, during the Cold War, Syria was a Soviet sphere. And one of the reasons that the wars between Syria and Israel were so important was because they took place in the context of the Cold War. At the eve of the revolution in Syria, the US State Department had, guess how many officials working on Syria in the entire State Department? One official worked on Syria, which showed you just how important it must have been to them. So what really is it? Well, it's the catalyst for all sorts of other issues. Ungoverned spaces, destabilization of allies, particularly the Gulf, the emergence of the Islamic State, which has now more or less been defeated militarily, but I would say ideologically we've got a long way to go, ladies and gents. ISIS, and of course the divisions that we had with the Gulf states over the presence of Iran in Syria. And the US looked around and it went, whew, who could we work with? Well, all of these rebels in northern Syria, every time we give them weapons, they either lose or they defect. They usually defect to Al-Qaeda, and then Al-Qaeda seems to defect to ISIS, and we've suddenly given weapons to people that are now ISIS. Well, that's not worked out very well. Well, who can we back? Well, there's 2.5 million Kurds who don't like ISIS very much, and they don't mind us. So why don't we have our little alliance and build it with the YPG? And that's what they did. And the YPG became a very effective actor on the ground and was able to take as much as 35% of Syrian territory, more or less defeating ISIS in its capital of Raqqa, in key cities like Manbij, and all the way down to the eastern border with Iraq. And so the US chose the YPG. And of course, that worked out quite well for Russia. Why did it work out well for Russia? Why? Because the YPG didn't care about Assad. They weren't fighting with Assad, limiting themselves to small skirmishes with Bashar's forces in areas where they came into contact. But their goal was never to overtake Damascus. Their goal was never to change the politics of the region other than to carve out an autonomous area for themselves. So it worked out very well for Russia. Thank you very much. These Kurds, they get rid of the bad guys, and they're not against ISIS. And so the two big powers realized that actually these Kurds were very useful indeed. And it indicated a cooperation on counterterrorism between the two big boys and a potential accommodation over the status of Bashar al-Assad. No Western government will ever say this, but I think it's pretty clear that in 2021, when Assad runs again for elections, and more or less likely to win those elections, that we will have to come to terms with the fact that he is staying. And that's going to be hard for some people that have invested the last 6 or 7 years of their career in removing him. But I'm afraid to say, reality bites. And that's the situation we are. And the problem with that is that this CT first strategy means that your diplomatic influence in the process to get rid of Assad is limited in the first place, because it's actually not what you're interested in. I would hazard a guess that there are very few officials in the State Department, even today, that care that much about whether Bashar al-Assad stays or doesn't stay. They're far more worried about Iran, and they're far more worried about the guys with the black flags. So what does that mean? Well, essentially, it puts us on the back foot. And we've been playing on the back foot in Syria for the last 6 years, essentially reacting to events rather than controlling them. But the YPG created some forward momentum, and it looked like a good option. Or was it a good option? No, it wasn't a good option. Why? Because there's a whacking great big NATO ally that doesn't really like the YPG at all. And one of the problems that has happened is that the more the United States has backed the YPG, the more angry these guys have got. And US-Turkey tensions are at their worst level for decades. There was a lot of hope from Mr. Erdogan that President Trump would reset the relationship. That didn't happen. Essentially what Mr. Trump did was to take on the policy of Barack Obama and give it a bit of steroids, pump it up, and continue on as normal. The Turks protested many, many times that this was wrong, that the YPG were an affiliate of the PKK, and that all they were doing was enabling what they saw as a terrorist entity to grow in Syria. And this tension, of course, has led to very, very bad blood on both sides. And mistrust and anger fuel this relationship between the two. I think it's fair to say that Turkey feels used by the US. It feels used as a platform for defeating ISIS and US interests without taking any account of its national security objectives. Meanwhile, the US feels cheated. Many, many times the US asked the Turks, can you contribute more to the fight? Only to be met with promise after promise which was not fulfilled. And so on both sides there are legitimate grievances, which has led to some of the problems that you're seeing at the moment. And we'll go into the Afrin operation in a second. Russia capitalized for sure and realized that this division between Ankara and Washington, D.C. was something that it could get right in the middle of to once again promote its own interest and to turn Turkey away from getting rid of Bashar al-Assad to its issue with the Kurds. Russia has been very successful at playing that card. Iran also benefited from the division, doubling down on its backing of Assad, knowing that the US was being distracted with other affairs. So the US has promised cooperation on the PKK. It's promised to act more against PKK activity in Turkey, in the Kandil Mountains. But the YPG is the major source of concern. And of course, that has led to this operation that we see today in Afrin. Afrin is this little canton in northwestern Syria, which contains around 200,000 Kurds, all very, very hard-line left-wing, I have to add, and very, very committed to the cause of the YPG, and also, I might say by extension, the PKK. Turkey has, for a number of months now, been raising the rhetoric. And the United States, on its part, has been inconsistent with its messaging. It said only in November that it was removing all weapons from the YPG. This month it then said it was creating a border force of 30,000 men using the YPG. So are you arming them? Are you not arming them? Are you turning them into a legitimate force? Are they an illegitimate force? Do you agree with their political goals? If so, why are you enabling them to control huge areas of territory in Syria? And why are you still arming them when you said you weren't going to arm them? It's all very confusing. Well, classic example of kicking the can down the road. It's a great policy option, by the way, if you can't decide what to do. And this is what happens, is that when you kick the can down the road, eventually you run out of road. And on Sunday, we ran out of road. And the Turks decided, for better or worse, that they were going to launch their own operation. So the US essentially said, okay, well, do you know what? It's not that important to our interests, actually. It's probably more of a Russian issue because they've got a big airbase sitting just there. Well, what do the Russians think? Well, the Russians went, well, they beat ISIS, so do we really need them? Our guy's Assad, maybe we should offer it to Assad. Kurds said over our dead body, and the Russians said, okay, that's fine then, you can fight the Turks. And that's what's happened, is that the US and Russia have essentially moved back and have issued statements. You know, in a conflict like Syria, when a country issues an angry statement that it's not going to do anything. Because why? In Syria, if you want to do something, you put men and you put weapons on the ground and you take territory. And that's been how this has been moving for the last year or two. And so the angry statements are a good indication of the fact that Washington and Moscow are quite happy to let this go. Is this another Kurdish sellout by the US? This one, yeah, probably. I would say with Iraq it was not the case. I think with Syria, actually, there's been a very, very quick U-turn on this issue. But of course, inconsistent and unclear US messaging will probably allow them to say that actually, well, we never really committed. So by allowing Afrin to be taken by Turkish forces, all we're doing is acknowledging Turkey's legitimate concerns, which we haven't really acknowledged for the last 18 to 24 months. Dancing on hot coals, I think, might be a good description of US policy on this issue. Can the Syrian Kurds survive? It's a very, very good question. One I don't have the answer to, other than to say, yes, I think they will. But I don't think they're going to be an independent entity. I'm not even sure if this area that they conquered, with the backing of the Americans and ourselves, I might add, will be under their control in a year's time, whether they may cede a lot of territory in Arab-held areas to maintain a presence in these areas where the Kurds dominate. Afrin, I think, will be gone. Here's what the Syrian Kurds need to do now. Are they affiliated with the PKK, or are they not affiliated with the PKK? And the structures in which the PKK still operate include all of the Syrian Kurdish parties and military wings. There has been no formal divorce. And whenever that happens, I think that this project is in severe jeopardy. The US will last as long as it has to blunt Iran and to blunt a resurgence of ISIS. But it could be gone in 2 years. It could be gone in 3 years. Turkey will be there for the next 40,000 years until it crashes into the Crimea and the Black Sea because of tectonic movements. So what will happen? Well, for now, they will be okay. And it looks to me like there's been a quid pro quo. Afrin goes, but they get to keep this bit. Nevertheless, for a Syrian Kurd, that's pretty emasculating. But Kurds have known throughout their history that great powers determine their future and have been preparing for it. So this is where Bashar al-Assad comes back. Maybe they do a deal with Assad. Maybe Assad takes the entire area back and gives the Kurds nominal autonomy or some form of limited, localized self-government. That might be their only answer, because the existential threat for the Syrian Kurds is Turkey. The political threat is Assad, and they would rather have a political threat than an existential threat. So, I think to end on that note, we've gone from two very strong emerging Kurdish entities to one almost non-existent Kurdish entity, but it is still a Kurdish entity, and one where we don't quite know where it ends in the future. And I think the next week or so will prove to us whether the United States is really keen on maintaining this area for the Syrian Kurds, or whether it's willing to bargain that away as well. So, food for thought. Slightly depressing if you're Kurdish. I don't think anyone here is Kurdish. Maybe they are. And I'm very happy to take your questions and your thoughts.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for that. If anybody did come in at lunchtime thinking that a united independent Kurdistan was conceivable in the near future, I doubt if you think it now. Anyone who has seen Monty Python's film The Life of Brian and the wonderful satire of factionalism that provides will have seen some echoes here, I think. Let me invite members of the audience to ask questions. Can I take James Clark and then Nicholas Barrington to start with, please? Just go ahead.
Why do you think there's the Turks are making a distinction between the way they handle Afrin and Rojava? You would think that if Afrin were a YPG threat to Turkey for its support to the PKK, Rojava, commanding a much longer piece of coast boundary, should pose an even greater threat. And I wonder, and I put to you, could it be that the Turks are aware of a potential huge problem in Idlib province, where something like 2 million potential refugees are gathering under enormous pressure, with their escape valve being freeing Turkey. And could it be that the Turks are clamping down on that escape valve in order to forestall a problem?
I think there's a long answer and a short answer. The short answer is that they make a differentiation because they have to, because the United States does. The United States currently has 2,500 or 2,200 troops in what effectively is Rojava, Syrian Kurdistan, SDF-held territory, anything north of the Euphrates River. There are no US troops at present in Afrin, only Russian. And so the key calculation for Turkey was how much was it willing to press? What is a critical interest that it cannot push on, and what is an interest that could be bargained away? Understanding that the US priorities are clearly counterterrorism and clearly pushing back against Iran, it has no desire to disrupt what the United States sees as a critical national security goal in Syria. Afrin doesn't really meet any of those conditions. Yes, it's upsetting for the Syrian Kurds, but it's not particularly upsetting for the United States. It's not an overly strategic area, actually. Something that I always find hilarious about people that talk about Syria is that every town that's taken and has been taken for the last 7 years is strategic. Is it really? And I don't really regard a village of 100 people as strategic. But anyway, such is life when covering Syria. And I think that the Turks have been guilty of overemphasizing the importance of the Afrin operation. I think there's clearly a political component to it. Erdogan needs a win against the YPG. He needs to sell that to his population. He needs to be seen to be doing something about the YPG. He can make his aggressive anti-American statements and look as if he's doing something, of course, which in the Turkish mindset is completely linked to the Rojava experiment, because it is in the Kurdish mindset. So, to the extent that that upsets the Americans, I think he's calculated quite well. The Idlib operations are interesting, and of course Turkey launched an Idlib operation in sort of late summer last year or early autumn. The Turks I talked to at that time were very clear that the main reason for launching that operation was, one, to try and present an alternative to the al-Qaeda factions which were operating in the area, and two, to start squeezing Afrin. That was very clear in their minds, that leverage on Afrin was one of the reasons they were going into Idlib at that point. I think it's important to note that in Idlib there are still 2 border crossings open that these, well, up to 2 million, who's counting, refugees could be spilling out from. I think it's important to understand that, for those of you that don't follow Syria that closely, that in the Idlib area, Bashar al-Assad is now launching a major operation with the Russians to try and clear the area of any, what he would term, terrorists, undesirables. What name you choose is up to you, but it's quite clear that al-Qaeda operates there. The issue is that actually al-Qaeda knew that this was coming and has prepared for it. And to that extent, I think it presents Turkey with a difficult position, and I think that their rhetoric has been, how should we say, slightly flexible when it comes to this issue of defeating terrorism. They've tried to put themselves on the good foot with the West by saying that they're taking on AQ elements. When really I see their operations in Idlib as largely being for show and for the dismemberment of the YPG in Afrin. So they can sell that line and say that, yes, they've killed a couple of HTS guys, but more or less, I think what you've said will come true. I think that these HTS guys will all come streaming out through the borders and will end up in mainland Turkey. Or if they clear a space in Afrin, if they're successful with this military operation, and there's no guarantee that they will be, they could put them there and de-Kurdify, or at least dilute the Kurdish presence in that area. So let's see what happens. I think a lot will be based on the 2 timelines of the 2 operations. Which one will be over first, the Idlib operation or the Afrin operation? And which is more important to Turkey? I think in terms of its offensive military capabilities, obviously it's Afrin. And its long-term security priorities, obviously it's Afrin. And so I think, once again, there's been a bit of a quid pro quo here. Not necessarily an agreed structure. I don't think that Russia and Turkey phone each other up and draw lines on maps. But what happens is that there's just an agreement that, does this impinge on your core interest? No, it doesn't. Okay, you can do that. Does this impinge on your core interest? No, it doesn't. Okay, well, that's fine. Russia wants to get rid of terrorists that oppose Assad. Turkey wants to get rid of terrorists that oppose Ankara. And so they both let each other get on with it. And that's the situation that we're in. 7 years of war has finally shown who the power brokers are, and it's not the Syrians.
Nicholas and then
very clear with the maps. I'm just one or two things I'm still not clear about. Maybe I should be. In that gap between the two Kurdish areas, is that the Al Qaeda area?
No, that's governed by a series of slightly disparate militias controlled by Turkey.
Turkey, yeah?
Yes, Turkey basically forcibly created that gap. And what you can see here is that the YPG tried to create these two pincers to form contiguous territory. The Turks realized that this was happening and launched what was known as Operation Euphrates Shield, and essentially backed ethnic Turkmen populations in Syria to take that area.
It's not the Al-Qaeda thing is further down.
The Al-Qaeda area
is
around here.
And that main SDF Kurdish area, what are their links with the Bazanis and the main people in Iraq? I mean, that's one question. The other is, are the YPG really terrorists at all? I mean, surely they're not. I mean, their alliance with that's what I still can't quite understand.
I think it depends on how you view it.
Yeah, I mean,
one man's terrorist is another's freedom fighter.
But I mean, are they involved in terrorist activities? They're very closely linked up with the group in Turkey. That's what the Turks claim. But I mean, is there evidence for that?
So here's what it is. Is the PKK involved in terrorist activity? Yes, it is. Absolutely, clearly. And they've targeted civilians. They have exploded suicide bombs in civilian areas. Offshoots of the PKK called the TAK, the TAK, launched mortars on civilian airports in Istanbul. I was actually at one of the airports when that happened.
There's no advantage for that group to be in alliance with them for that reason.
But they are them.
They are.
Right?
They are.
The guys that were running the YPG, the older chaps, were in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon in the 80s training together.
I see.
So they go back a long way. And there are often, I have these conversations with people who say, well, surely the YPG or the PYD, which is the political party associated with them, could be kind of DPKKized. I said, are you going to tell me I'm not British?
I see.
You know, I've grown up as British. I am British. These guys grew up as PKK. They are PKK.
But this is not true of those other areas in the larger area there.
I think not.
Forgive me.
That's enough.
But
no, that's fine. But I think in the interests of finishing on time, we should move quickly. Can I ask you?
Yes, I think Western newspaper readers have an image of the Kurdish Peshmerga as doughty freedom fighters, and might have expected the Kurdish aspirations through the referendum to put up more of a resistance to Baghdad. You comment briefly on how Kurdish aspirations just collapsed.
Sure. I think at the time when you were ambassador in Iraq, they were hardy freedom fighters. And I think it's very fair to say that what I would term their parents' generation have reputations as being heroes for a reason. They fought against a pretty brutal dictatorship and managed to hold their own. They lived pretty hardy lives in the mountains and put up with some appalling conditions. I'm afraid to say I think that whilst the Peshmerga basic infantry units are qualitatively slightly better than the Iraqi basic infantry units, there's still an issue there. And there's a number of issues that I could readily identify. One, ghost soldiers. I think that the Kurdish Peshmerga massively overinflate their available fighting strength. Two, the actual fighting strength that is there is largely part-time outside of Division 70 and 80 between KDP and PUK. The special forces, the Zeravani, the CTG under Lahu Talabani, yes, actually, they're pretty good. And that goes all the way back to the training that the Israelis offered them in the 70s. I mean, there are units within the Peshmerga who are extremely brave, extremely good at counterterrorism work, can operate in urban environments, and more or less could take on anything, the best that the Iraqi state could throw at them. The rank and file, I'm not so sure. And there's two issues here. One is a military issue and a qualitative military issue, and one is a political issue. They don't have air power. Should this have gone to a conflict between Baghdad and Erbil, two things would have happened. One, Baghdad would have used air power, and it would have ground the Kurds down slowly over time by doing that. Two, the sovereign state is Baghdad. Where would the Kurds have got their armaments from? After 6 months, even after 6 weeks, they would have been short on ammunition. I think they would have struggled very, very badly indeed after the first couple of weeks. And the political issue is this. These boys on the front lines, these Peshmergas, which represent the political parties, are one of the main reasons that the political parties are powerful. They ensure your access to resources, they secure oil, and they make sure that if people don't like you in your political area, that you go send the boys round and knock the door down at 2 a.m. Now, if half your boys that you send round at 2 a.m. are dead because they fought the Iraqis, that degrades your political power quite significantly. And I think, I'm afraid to say, and I'm going to be cynical, I think there was a huge amount of self-interest from the Kurdish political parties to protect their patronage networks, protect their income streams. And I'm not sort of trying to be a populist here, but I think there was a little bit of to hell with the Kurdish population, which I find rather remarkable given that they had manipulated the Kurdish population with these nationalist sentiments, and then when push came to shove, ordered the withdrawal. And the third issue, I think, linked to the political, is that the KDP thought the PUK would fight. And when the PUK didn't fight, the KDP realised it was on its own and decided also to withdraw. So political factions, qualitative military issues, and political self-interest.
Right. Well, I've already got one question on the back row, and I now have a flurry of others. So let's see how time goes, but I will come. Yes.
Thank you. Just quickly, you may have covered it there. Is there a unifying figure, other than obviously the PKK leader who's in jail, throughout the Kurdish areas, either Kurdish Iraq or Syria, or all together, or a younger generation, which could unify the Kurds? Because that seems to be one of the main political problems you were just saying, the factions.
I think the space for one is emerging. It's a really good question. Is there any political figure that could unify 35 to 40 million Kurds spread across 4 countries that speak wildly different dialects of Kurdish? Well, I would say this. I think that PKK elements, frankly, are pretty threatened by politicians that look to overtake their dominance. And one of the things I found interesting about Selahattin Demirtas and the HDP as they emerged as power brokers in Turkey was that it wasn't just Erdogan that was upset, it was the PKK themselves. Why? Because Demirtas was a Democrat, more or less. Yes, his brother and his cousins had served in the PKK, but Demirtas himself had not and was not associated with those things. And he was advocating for political integration through Turkish state structures. Now, he came up against an autocrat like Erdogan who's not interested in state structures. But nevertheless, what he did was he pulled the rug out from underneath Cemil Bayek in the PKK, who, I will cynically say, benefit from conflict with the Turkish state because they can present themselves as the legitimate face of Kurdish political opposition. And so to me, I think that there was, frankly, a bit of tension there, and I think that the PKK, over their dead bodies, would allow a sort of unifying figure that was not Abdullah Öcalan. And one of the things, by the way, they can lionize Abdullah Öcalan because Abdullah Öcalan is locked up in a prison, unable to say anything. So if Öcalan disagreed with anything the PKK was saying at present, it would never get out anyway, because it's obviously controlled by Turkish authorities. And so this lionization of Abdullah Öcalan as the embodiment of Kurdish national self-interest is a bit convenient, because nobody actually knows what Abdullah Öcalan thinks anymore. Could Öcalan be the unifying figure? No, I don't think so. I think that, whilst portraits of him, are of him in his glory days, aged about 45, I mean, he's pushing his 70s now. I'm not sure he's quite the young unifying figure that the Kurds are looking for. You have a couple of guys in Iraqi Kurdistan who are coming up. This guy, Shaswa Abdul Hamid, who runs a TV station called NRTV. It's based in Sulaymaniyah. Bravely enough, he ran a no campaign in Iraqi Kurdistan. It wasn't a no per se, it was more of a no for now, because I don't think any Kurd really believes in a no, but they believe in a no for now. What's interesting is that Shaswar has become more popular. Now, he was a reviled figure before the referendum, partly because he was seen as going against the sort of nationalist, jingoistic curve that was happening within Kurdistan before the referendum. But he's kind of been proven right by everything that he's said. His star is on the rise. I saw him on Twitter campaigning in Erbil a couple of weeks ago. Now, he was arrested by Kurdish authorities over the Christmas period. Again, one of these things that many people miss because we're all eating turkey. But the situation is that he could present an alternative. Now, again, over the KDP's dead body, would he start winning votes in KDP areas? First of all, we have to acknowledge that the KDP have been responsible for some very serious voting infractions and misdemeanors in their areas, and they need to address those. This issue of having more than 100% turnout in areas in which they are tribally very strong needs to be addressed. I'm afraid to say Shaswar has no chance of political infiltration into those areas, whatever that sort of, Tammany Hall style politics is going on, just with the sort of Kurdish slant to it. Now, in areas of southeastern Iraqi Kurdistan, yes, he could make a serious dent. Here's the problem, he's got no guns. If you want influence in Iraqi Kurdistan, you've got to have guys with guns. It's very simple. And you've got to be able to pay them. Shaswar Abdulhamid is a very rich man, but he doesn't have the loyalty of particularly Kurds in southeastern areas of Iraqi Kurdistan. Those are still PUK figures. And I think they will remain loyal to PUK. So it will take some time for those structures to break down. But look, there is definitely a debate going on at the moment in Iraqi Kurdistan about trashing the existing order. Whether it will happen or not is another matter.
We are close to our time, but there were 3 hands up earlier. If you'd like to show yourselves again, thank you. I think if we can keep the questions and the answers short, I can take all 3. So let's go in this order. 1, 2, 3.
Question about Russian policy towards the operation in Afrin. And it seemed to us, and I work in IHS Country Risk, that the Turks wouldn't have begun a ground operation without getting the green light from Russia, because Russia controls the aerospace over that area, and also because there were Russian military personnel in Afrin. But now looking at the operation, the forces that the Turks have committed don't match Erdogan's rhetoric or the force level that they've got on the Turkish side of the border. So it seems to us that the Turks will be allowed to go as far as the Russians let them, and will be allowed to stay in Syria as long as the Russians let them. But the Russians are really in controlling influence over it.
Could I, before you answer that, Michael, could I just take the other 2 questions and then perhaps I have a composite answer?
You've not mentioned France. French have had, I believe, more French armed forces in KRI than the British, for instance, and been very more proactive. Historically, the French have been very clever and devious, working in Turkey and KRI oil and so on. And now Macron has been to Beirut and places like that, getting more high profile. What's the role France playing in all this?
Thank you. Imagine.
A quick one is, what emboldened the Turks to go for Afrin where they've never really gone seriously at Kandil, which probably was more of a threat than Afrin's ever been?
Sure. So I'll link those 2 questions together. I think they do want to go to Kandil. And I think that, by the way, their price for normalisation with Barzani, their pound of flesh, will be to get the KDP to start looking at Kandil. By the way, again, happened over Christmas. The PKK in Kandil announced a change in administrative system in Kandil, which nobody said anything about, not even Baghdad. So they are looking at this sort of self-government system in Kandil as well. Here's the problem. I mean, if you want to go up into Kandil and fight there for an extended period of time, be my guest, but you're going to lose a lot of men. So the proxies that Turkey have are not great. Frankly speaking, the Turks would find it logistically difficult to operate in those areas. They tend to bomb from, quite high altitude. So they can sort of keep a relative lid on the problem. There have been a couple of airstrikes in the last week or so, but they've been talking about both Sinjar and Kandil as the next ports of call after Afrin. So let's see what happens there, because Sinjar would have to be calculated in coordination with the Iraqi government as well as Kandil. I'm not so sure Abadi would be really, really happy to let that happen at the present time. Maybe after the elections, maybe wait till May, and then let's see what flexibility Abadi has. The issue here, of course, with Afrin, I don't think, by the way, that it was ever that the Russians gave Turkey a green light. The Russians looked for an alternative option, which was to get the Kurds to hand the territory to Assad, which would then stop the Turks from going in. The Kurds said no to that, and as a result, Russia didn't actually say yes, it just pulled back towards the airbase that it held. I think the Turks understood that that was a yellow light, and a yellow light is as good as a green light, but it's not necessarily a specific authorization. For example, I don't think that there's any type of hotline between Moscow and Ankara where they coordinate all these things. It's simply not done that way. But the Turks have calculated that clearly Russia's okay with this for now. The key in my mind is whether the city of Afrin itself is on Turkey's bucket list. And if it is, then that's going to be a hell of a fight, because there's 200,000 people there. And the Kurds in that area are particularly well trained and have been for a while. The longer this operation goes on, then we'll really see what's left of the Turkish Air Force, because obviously over 50% of their senior officers in the Air Force have been stripped of their ranks, and some are in jail and some are sort of on permanent gardening leave. Let's see, because the longer this operation goes on, the lower the ammunition stocks go, then they've got to start turning towards people to buy ammunition, and the airframes start to wear out. You can't run hundreds of sorties a day without your maintenance and upkeep of the aircraft suddenly becoming a real issue. And then we'll really see if Turkey is a strategic actor or whether it's just fiddling around at the tactical level. So let's, I think, look and see how that plays out. I don't think Russia will come to the rescue of Afrin unless there looks to be some major humanitarian crisis, in which case then the pressure on Turkey will ratchet up to the point where they will probably have to back away, and their goals will be very limited. What was the other question?
France.
France,
and
yes.
We have 1 minute left.
Well, the French took the same position as we did in the United States on the referendum. They were strongly against it. They have more troops in Syria than we ever had as well. So I don't think that there was ever a question that the French were not active on the Kurdish front. François Hollande was greeting YPG fighters in the Elysée, if you remember, a couple of years back. It was quite clear that I think the French viewed this as a strategic, asset for them. But again, I don't think that they've been willing to go against US policy in that area. I genuinely see that the US as the controlling stake. I think the United Kingdom has a little bit of say, but a very little bit of say, and I think that the French again play around the edges on this. I think the most effective way of dealing with the Iraqi Kurdish problem would be if we aligned our messaging with France and Germany as an E3 bloc, partly because it involves so much to do with the Iranian question as well, that I think those all need to be aligned. And then actually, in terms of our macro policy, if we don't like what the Americans are doing, and there are some things I think we can all agree that we don't agree with the Americans on in the Middle East, there's a serious weight of diplomatic effort coming from Europe that says to Trump, hang on a second, this isn't working. Have you thought of something else? I don't think either ourselves, the French, and the Germans have been relatively active in Iraq, but they're still sidelined, I think. Any of us operating by ourselves is just not enough to get into that mix. So that's the issue I think that we really need to think about. In terms of things like arming the Kurds, unilaterally providing them with anti-tank weapons, which is what the French were doing, that's not going to happen anymore. They will reroute everything through Baghdad because they have committed themselves to the One Iraq policy and the sovereign actor being Baghdad and not Erbil. Yes, of course, they were very concerned about Abadi taking over ethnic Kurdish territory in Iraq, and messaged, as we did, as the Americans did, that he needed to stop. And he abided by those warnings. Yes, Macron is popular, but he's as limited as anybody else when it comes to these issues.
I'm going to close it there. Thank you very much indeed, Michael. The Kurds were a difficult issue when this society was formed in 1901, and I don't know whether it's encouraging or not that they remain on the agenda now, but I think that was for us an extremely informative and detailed explanation of why they're going to remain an issue for a considerable length of time yet. Please join me in thanking you.